Hello, everyone. It is January 8th, just after noon my time, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Trump, Greenland, Canada, and Russia and Ukraine. So, what sparked this discussion is my observation just on Twitter. But Twitter is real life, as we know. Kind of is. But my observation that most, if not quite all, of the pro-NATO faction and pro-Ukrainian faction and liberals in general are up in arms about the prospect that Trump might purchase Greenland, integrate that as some sort of territory, that Canada might become the 51st state, or perhaps there would be 10 new states and 3 provinces. It's probably how it would go down. But some sort of unification with Canada, I don't think anyone in their right mind would think that American troops would invade Canada in some brutal conquest and suppression of Canadians and so on. But there is the suggestion of a sort of unification, and that's met with resistance. But what I am talking about is the fact that pro-NATO personalities and thinkers and analysts, pro-Ukraine people are up in arms about this prospect and are just in a knee-jerk fashion against it. I think they're wrong, and it's very disappointing to see this. I would suggest to them that Trump's geopolitical posturing, his geopolitical ideas, are actually very good for Ukraine in the sense that someone who is thinking in these ways, on these terms, is much, much more likely to continue to support Ukraine, maybe even support it with more lethal aid than Joe Biden. Remember, Joe Biden and the liberals have not exactly been great in terms on Ukraine, in terms of giving Ukraine the weaponry that it needs. They've done a sort of slow roll, one step back, 2 steps forward. You know what I'm talking about. I think Trump very likely will be better on these matters. And the fact that he is thinking in these big, bold imperial terms is part of that. Now, all of this remains to be seen. The talk about Greenland in Canada might be bluster. We have heard it before. It might be dropped and never happen. Trump might, in fact, pursue the Charlie Kirk or Tucker Carlson strategy and claim that he's a peacemaker by just shutting off aid to Ukraine and abandoning it and shaking hands with Russia, with Putin, that is. And I might very well be wrong, and I will be the first to admit that I am wrong. But I don't think I'm wrong, and I am actually deeply encouraged by Trump's posturing, his big ideas, and I'm deeply encouraged by what this would mean for an imperial America to support Ukraine. So I'm going to be brief because this is a big picture argument that I'm making. So I think a lot of people who support Ukraine, at least the way that they justify it in a sort of national sovereignty, League of Nations, UN type way. What they are in effect arguing is that after 1945, or some decades after, that all borders and nation states have effectively been frozen. They have been frozen in ice. We have just simply agreed that these are the borders, And if you step 1 foot across these borders, you're in violation of international law and you're a monster. Now, let me be clear. I do think Putin is a monster. I do think that what Putin has done to the Ukrainian people in attacks, not only on military targets, but on civilian targets, urban areas, I think this is terrible. I 100% reject it, and I back Ukraine. However, let's also be honest about geopolitics in the situation. Borders change. People migrate. There were millions of Germans who migrated back into Germany after the end of the Second World War. The borders of Germany have shifted so many times over the course of the 19th century and 20th century that you can't really keep up with it. I do think that there is a core German culture and population that is ethnic and religious, although that's a little bit ambiguous, being that many Germans are Catholic, most are Protestant, and linguistic, obviously. Although even there you have some little ambiguities and so on. That being said, the borders, what is Germany, what is the German state, have shifted all over the place over the late 19th and 20th century. So things change. And there are points in time where it just becomes natural for some sort of unification to occur. I think that is clearly the case with the United States and Canada. We obviously have different histories. You can go back to the French Indian War. You could look at all sorts of different things. War of 1812 that will reveal different dynamics and contested territory, etc. The Queen is still on the Canadian loonie. It's still part of the British Empire in some shape or form. But the reality of the situation is that the United States and Canada have a very, very similar culture, a North American culture that is largely Anglo, if not entirely. America has the Southwest and a Spanish-speaking culture. Canada has the French-speaking culture, and sure, there is a rivalry and some resentment and et cetera, et cetera. But let's just be honest here. There really is a discernible core North American culture. There is obviously a discernible core economic relationship between America and Canada. America is just obviously so much larger, but America sort of needs Canada too. It's not a one-way street. It's not entirely a one-way street in terms of military protection of the North American continent as well. Canada does play a role in that. Canada is a member of NATO. Canada is obviously in an unshakable, good relationship with the United States. But in terms of defending, particularly the three territories of Canada, in terms of defending this massive land swath, that would be impossible without NORAD and without the United States. So what is holding us back? Just some accident of history? What is holding us back from just simply unifying into one large government? This is something that would be totally consensual. I'm sure there are people in Canada who wouldn't like it. To be honest, if Canada Canadians were offered the chance to travel freely without the passport. I mean, they could more or less do that now. You do need to show a passport at the northern border. Lower taxes, the chance of working in the United States, of maybe even living in your hometown, but having a just a deeper and easier business relationship with U.S. companies. They might not say it now, but I think they're going to take the offer once they look at the big picture. I mean, is Canadian nationalism so strong that they would really be against a unification with the United States? Are we dealing with, German culture vis-a-vis Nigeria, where there are these just huge ethnic, racial, religious, cultural, historical differences, and just never the twain can meet? We're just so out of step with each other. We couldn't ever unify. We couldn't even talk to each other. I mean, no, that's clearly not the case with the U.S. and Canada. It just simply makes sense. Greenland also makes sense. Now, is Greenland Europe or is it North America? You can, I guess, make arguments either way. Iceland is integrated into the European Union. Greenland, kind of, sort of. I've actually done research on this morning, and it's rather confusing. But Greenland has tremendous geographic strategic importance. Greenland is a site of tremendous natural resources when it comes to fisheries, when it comes to rare earth minerals. China is very interested in Greenland. That is something to be very wary of. And so I think the purchase of Greenland, that some sort of integration, is it a new state? Is it a kind of territory like Puerto Rico? I don't quite know how it would play out. But doesn't this just make a lot of sense? And wouldn't the half dozen people who live in Greenland benefit from it? Wouldn't it just be better to be part of America? I think if ultimately given the choice, they would say yes to that. The fact that Greenland does have natural resources, that's a reality. These are largely not fully exploited. That's certainly an enticement for Trump. But it also, the fact that China is getting very interested in those resources, and one motivation for Trump, at least I think, is to keep China out of that, to basically dominate our hemisphere in a Monroe-like fashion. This shows that Trump sees the world, maybe on a gut level, but also maybe on an intellectual level. I know we're dealing with Trump and his statements are largely buffoonish, but he does have an intellect. This might indicate that he's seeing the world in terms of big imperial blocks. We have to confront China, which is a civilizational state. We have to confront China's increasingly good, I'll put that in quotes, relationship with Russia. And securing this hemisphere would be a major step forward in doing that. Now, I've already made arguments about how I don't believe that Donald Trump is going to sell out Ukraine. I think many people in MAGA, the Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk types, and granted, Charlie Kirk is friends with Donald Trump Jr. He traveled to Greenland. He's no doubt talking to Trump on a regular basis. I mean, this is rather concerning on many levels, not to mention the fact that he's ultimately just a obnoxious rube. But it's also concerning that his ideas about Ukraine would hold sway with Donald Trump. But let's remember, Donald Trump is Donald Trump. Donald Trump is the leader. Donald Trump is the alpha, for better and for worse. And people like Charlie Kirk and Tucker Carlson are really ultimately going to follow along. We have a lot of history of these people even kind of inching away from Trump, thinking that they might want to to dump Trump, and they won't ultimately do it because people like Tucker and Charlie Kirk are beta males, and they're just going to follow along with the alpha. He butters their bread, and they even recognize this on some basic level. I don't think it's in Trump's personality to back down against Russia. If Trump or some people around Trump want to hand off parts of Ukraine's sovereign territory to Russia, my guess is that Russia would reject that offer. The reason for that is that if you froze the conflict right now, if you take the lines on maps of the current stalemate trench warfare that we're seeing, Russia would in effect be giving over territory that it has already recognized. Russia is not going to want that deal. It's going to want more. I think Putin is, his own personality is, he's likely to engage in a kind of sunk cost fallacy where he feels that so much has been invested in Ukraine, that Ukraine is so strategically important to the Russian Empire. Remember, when Ukraine had a referendum for sovereignty in 1991, after that occurred, immediately afterward, the Soviet Union just collapsed. The Soviet Union could not make sense geographically without Ukraine. It had to fall into rump Russia after that fact. So I think Putin has just invested too much for him to psychologically give up on Ukraine. I think he wants more. Any offer that Trump makes of let's just freeze the conflict, you can have these eastern territories, I think he's actually going to reject it. And when that happens, Trump is going to fire back at Putin in an angry, resentful, bold, fiery fashion. If Putin rejects a peace offer that Trump honestly gives, Trump will never let him hear the end of it. And he will absolutely begin supporting Ukraine in a war for national sovereignty, or really a war for victory that is pushing Russians out of all of the territory. Now, look, am I engaging in some wishful thinking? Perhaps. As I said, if my calculation is incorrect, I will acknowledge that. I'll be the first to acknowledge it. I was simply wrong. Let's also remember that I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I voted for Kamala Harris, and it wasn't because I loved her and the liberals exactly. But one of the primary motivations, if not the number one issue, was Ukraine. The MAGA intellects, such as they are, have been demonizing Ukraine. They want to sell it out completely. They would probably write off the entire country to Vladimir Putin if they could. And they make these just inane arguments like, you know, we sent $50 billion in military aid to Ukraine, and that's why we have a homeless problem, or that's why we don't have national health care, or that's why we can't fight the wildfires in Los Angeles, or just obviously incorrect, bad faith arguments like that. I didn't want to have anything to do with them, in fact. So, I have been extremely skeptical of Trump, but I can also call balls and strikes, and I can also assess the situation. Trump moving in this geostrategic, global way to secure and empower the American empire leads me to believe that he is much, much more likely to support Ukraine than many of us, and I include myself in that, calculated just months ago. But anyway, we live in interesting times, and we'll see. Just a thought.